Hello everybody and welcome to part 2 of the Dovetail box series. In this video, you're going to learn how to mark out the dovetail joints. Alright, so before we get stuck into this video, remember the mantra that I shared with you in the past video. It doesn't matter how accurate you are with a saw or a chisel if you're working to inaccurate lines. Keep that in your head as we're going through this, please. So on this box, the longer, thinner sides are going to have the tails of the dovetail, and then those are going to be nested into the pins on the short, wide components. So what we're going to do is, firstly, we need to mark out the base lines on the edge of these, or the shoulder lines as they're otherwise known. And I'm going to use a marking gauge for that. This is a Veritas wheel marking gauge and is just perfect for cutting across the grain, for cutting with the grain. I haven't had to sharpen this / replace the wheel in the 6 or 7 years that I've owned it. They last a very long time, providing you recess it into the head like that and don't drop it on the concrete floor. Amazing tools. So if you've watched all the videos in my online school up until this point, then you would have already covered how to cut a dovetail joint by hand and how to mark it out and everything like that. This is going to be going back over that again, but in the context of this box project. So still worth watching, but those of you who haven't already watched the video on how to dovetail correctly, definitely go back and watch that. So what we're going to do with this is set the marking gauge to just be ever so slightly proud of the top surface of this material. And this is a very, very small amount, because whatever I've got overhanging with the marking gauge here is going to be how much end grain is overhanging after the box is assembled. And you know, it's always easier to plane down end grain on the dovetail joints as opposed to planing this flush at the end, but you don't want it to be too excessive. Like just a small amount, that's not even half a mil, not even 1/4 of a millimeter overhanging, that'll be fine. So on the longer components, which are going to be the tails, we need to put this marking gauge line round all 4 edges of this, because we're going to be cutting the corners off. However, on the pins, the shorter components, we only need to put these marks on the front and on the back. We don't need to do it on the sides. And by the way, if you haven't already, definitely have a look at my video on how to use a marking gauge correctly. I know it seems simple, but there's a lot of things that people overlook when using these things. So have a look at that. There is a link in the top corner, and then come back to this video. So what I'll do is just lay the components on top of one another like that. And on the tails, we're going to mark a very shallow line on the outside and on the sides of the component. But then on the inside of them, where we've got no markings whatsoever, we're going to make that mark quite deep, and you'll see why later on. It's a little trick I like to use when aligning the tails with the pins afterwards. So just to reiterate that, very light on the front and the top and bottom edges, and then very heavy on the inside edge. So light, 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 and then heavy. And then moving to the pins, as I said, these only need to be marked on the front and the back. And again, we can make these quite nice and light on the outside, and then slightly heavier on the inside, but it's not too much of an issue here. All right, so those are all marked out, and the baselines are scratched around all 4 sides on the tails, and just the front and back on the shorter pin components. Now we'll start laying out the dovetails, and what I like to do is put it upright in the vise, slightly higher up, so then I can get access to it with my dovetail saddle marker. This dovetail marker is from Veritas, and there'll be a link to it in the tool list for this project. I've opted for a 1:6 ratio in this, which is traditionally quite steep for a hardwood such as poplar, but I've already done a video debunking the myth of what ratio should you use for hardwoods versus what ratio should you use for softwoods. There's a lot of rules that are thrown around out there within woodworking that don't really have a lot of justification behind them. So that video addresses the topic of what dovetail ratio should you use, and there is a link to it below. If you don't have a dovetail marker like this, you could also use a sliding bevel to mark out the angle of the dovetails. Again, you draw out the dovetail ratio, match it with the sliding bevel, and then you can draw the ratios on and all that. But this is all something that's addressed in the video, what dovetail ratio should you use. There is a link in the top corner if you want to go and have a look at that. I'll definitely recommend you do if you're at this stage and a little bit confused as to what angle to go for. So on this particular box, the dovetails are slightly offset to account for the plinth that goes around the bottom. If these weren't offset, then the final result would kind of look a little bit unbalanced. So I can see here that I've got my face edge just poking out, which means that that is the bottom of the box. So my offset is going to start from here. So by following the spacing as detailed in the plans, I can accurately mark out this offset. So I'm just putting a little mark on the end grain for the time being. And then with these marks, I'm just going to carefully line up the saddle marker with the line on the end grain, square it across, and then down the face. And I'm making sure to use a nice sharp pencil for this. If your pencil's blunt, then that line's going to be way too thick to work too accurately later on. Some people like to use a knife to mark out these lines, which is fair enough. I have no doubt that gives you a very accurate line to follow. But at this point, even if you don't quite get those lines completely accurate, we're going to be tracing around them later on with a knife anyway, in order to perfectly fit them into the tails. So using a pencil at this point isn't the end of the world, but what you do need to make sure is that it's sharp. It needs to be sharp, or else you're not going to be able to cut this end grain accurately. Next, what I'll do is carefully mark out the areas that are going to be waste. At this point, if I cut the wrong side of the line, it's not the end of the world, but it's really good practice to mark the areas that you're going to be removing with a saw. That is what you're going for with your marking out. It's got to be crisp, and it's got to be accurate. If there's any kind of wavering with your lines, then it's going to be difficult to work to them accurately later on. So I'll do the same to the other side. Again, the face edge is on the bottom here, so I'll start marking out the offset using that as a reference. So for those of you who are using a sliding bevel to do this, what you'll do is you get your bit of plywood to draw your ratio on. So I'll do a little mark there, mark 1 centimeter across, and then square a line up from that second mark. And then if we want to do a 1:6 ratio, for example, because we've gone 1 unit across being 1 centimeter, we'll mark 6 units up, which is 6 centimeters. Join those together, and there you go. We've got a line that matches the dovetail ratio of 1:6. So I'll simply set the sliding bevel to that angle and lock it down. And then we'll square these lines across the end grain using an engineer's square. And then I'll do a little mark on each corner just to show where that line on the end grain ends on each face, and then draw that down with the sliding bevel. And of course, mark out the waste. Okay, so at this point, I'll just do a quick visual check to make sure that I've offset everything from the face edge, and I can see that I've got a larger pin here and a smaller pin at the top, which is consistent across all of them, so that's fine. But also just put them up against one another and just make sure it's all good. So I'm happy with that. The other thing is that I haven't bothered drawing the tails on the back of the components or anything like that, because when I'm sawing these out, I'm only going to be able to see the front and the top as I'm doing so. It's not really a whole lot of point doing the back, but that's completely up to you. If you want to do that, then crack on. And there you go. That is how you mark out the tails of a dovetail joint. Make it clean, make it accurate. I'm going to say it again. If your marking out lines are inaccurate, it doesn't matter how accurate you are with a saw, a plane, a chisel. Later on, if your marking out lines are inaccurate, your work is going to be inaccurate too. Take your time with this stage. If you get this bit wrong, it's going to haunt you through the rest of the project. So once you've done that, you're then ready to move on to the next lesson. You can do so by clicking the link below, which will take you directly to my website where you can get access to all the resources available. Press the big round subscribe button if you haven't already, and follow me on social media if you haven't already. See you in the next lesson.